In this video, we're going to talk about the origin of a species and how evolution over time can actually lead to new species forming. Remember Darwin's book that he published was called Origin of a Species. So first let's talk about evolution. There's actually two main types of evolution. First off, microevolution. Micro means small. So microevolution is the changes that occur within a species, and these are pretty well documented. We know that bacteria over time develop resistances to antibiotics. We know that insects develop resistances to pesticides. We have lots and lots of evidence that supports this idea that changes occur within species. Macroevolution, this is the one that creationists and people that don't like evolution have a lot harder time with. Macroevolution is actually the evolution of one species into a new species, right? That humans were once a non-human species, that we evolved into humans from something else. So this is kind of a bigger step. Obviously it takes a lot more time, but we're going to talk about some of the ways with which speciation can occur. First off, when we look at organisms, just like when you guys did that phylogenetic tree activity and you were looking at all the different animals and trying to figure out which were closely related, looking at just physical similarities is sometimes not very useful. This is an eastern and a western meadowlark. I can't tell them apart. They look identical, but they are separate species. They don't interbreed, they don't share a common gene pool, right? If we look at this group of individuals, they are the same species. They can all interbreed and produce fertile offspring, which is the definition of a species. So when we talk about species, we're really talking about, can they interbreed? In other words, are they interfertile, or are they separate? Are their gene pools not mixing together? That's really what we're talking about when we talk about a species, not just what they look like. So what are some things that can actually prevent individuals from interbreeding and can cause speciation? Well, some barriers can be pre-zygotic, in other words, before the zygote forms. Some can involve a blocking at the mating point. Some are after fertilization. So example of pre-zygotic barriers would be habitat isolation. They're just removed. They can't physically meet. Lions and tigers are not in the same area. They can't interbreed, okay? Or behavioral isolation. If I'm a songbird and I'm singing one song, only those members of my species are going to respond to it. Members of a different species will not respond to my song and will not want to mate with me because, again, behaviorally, they want to hear a different song. Okay, temporal isolation. Temporal means time, so this is the timing. This is more common in plants where the males have to release pollen at the same time that the female parts of the flowers are receiving that pollen, right? So if over time we start pollination and flowering at different times, that's going to prevent intermixing of individuals and speciation will be formed. In terms of mating, we could just have mechanical isolation. Cannot physically mate anymore, right? Too big and too small, too different in terms of size. Or gametic isolation. The sperm and the egg are just too different to actually unite and form a viable offspring. Okay. If we do get fertilization occurring, some of the post-zygotic variables can be reduced hybrid viability. So the fertilized egg just results in a miscarriage, or it develops, but it develops with severe abnormalities, or reduced hybrid fertility. So when horses and donkeys mate, they produce a mule. It's an offspring, but the mules are sterile. They cannot then continue to pass on their genes. Or hybrid breakdown, where hybrids have low fertility levels and they just don't reproduce very well. Those are some post-zygotic variables. In terms of speciation, two things can occur. Number one, allopatric speciation. Allo meaning away from. This is like allosteric inhibitors, where something blocks an enzyme away from the active site. So this is when populations are physically separated and now they're no longer interbreeding because of a barrier like a canyon, or islands are a good example of allopatric speciation. We physically separate individuals. Sim means the same. Sympatric means something has happened within a population where now we have a new population that is not interbreeding with other individuals of that population. We'll talk about one example that's quite common in plants where this can occur. This is obviously very rare in animals, but we'll talk about how this can happen in plants. First off, if we do have allopatric speciation, separating of individuals, well, when a speciation occurred, well, we know speciation has occurred if when they get rejoined, if they are no longer interbreeding. If they do interbreed, they're still the same species, right? But if they now, when they are reunited, are no longer breeding because of behavioral or temporal differences, we know that new species have formed. I talked about how sympatric speciation can occur within plants, where plants in the same area all of a sudden form new species. And that usually happens through a process called autopolyploidy. Auto means self, poly means many, ploidy means chromosome number. So what can happen in plants during meiosis if the chromosomes don't separate, we end up with sex cells that are diploid, not haploid. Since many plants can fertilize themselves, a diploid cell and a diploid cell produces a tetraploid cell. Well, that tetraploid cell is going to be probably only able to reproduce with other tetraploid species. So that can be like an instant speciation in plants. This happens actually quite frequently. Many flowering and fruiting plants that we're familiar with are actually the result of polyploidy. Remember, strawberries we said are octoploidy. They have 8 sets of chromosomes. So an example of sympatric speciation is polyploidy. Then we talked about allopatric speciation, and we said islands are a really good example of that, right? Because let's talk about the Galapagos Islands. So we have these iguanas that got from Ecuador out to the Galapagos, and then some of them got to a second island or a third island, and again, as they moved, they became physically separated from the other iguanas, and over time they formed new species, or Darwin's finches, a better example of these birds. As they got to each new island, they adapted the populations to the food and to the climate of that island, and they became new species. The term for that is adaptive radiation. Radiation means to kind of fan out and form many new varieties or species. So we see this a lot on islands, this idea of allopatric speciation by means of adaptive radiation. Then the last thing we're going to talk about is the modes or models for speciation. Darwin always talked about a gradual model, that there was this sort of slow and incremental change, or species slowly changed, and it took a long time, and we saw gradual changes. And the term we use for that now is gradualism. Gradualism is what it sounds like, slow, steady changes. But two scientists about 40 years ago, Gould and Eldridge, came up with this idea. When they looked at fossils, they said, you know what, there's actually a lot of evidence that many species undergo long periods of no change, punctuated by a rapid new emergence of another species, usually some change in the environment. So volcanoes cause a change in temperature, or some other geological event causes some massive change. That causes, again, rapid speciation, and the term they use for that is punctuated equilibrium. So equilibrium means balance, but that balance is punctuated by rapid change. So long periods of no change, and then boom, meteorite hits Earth 65 million years ago, mammals explode, many new forms of mammals appear because the dinosaurs are gone. That's a good example of a punctuated equilibrium. Good example of gradualism is the horse. If we look at the horse over the last 50 million years, we see we start with something about the size of a small dog. It's got 3 toes and it's got really small teeth. It lives in the forest, and this is actually a good size and good traits for living in the forest. As that forest in Mongolia turned over time into grasslands and plains, the horse got bigger and it lost its toes, because running on one toe is a lot faster on a grassland. So what we see as this gradual change occurred in Mongolia is the horses got bigger, they lost their toes, now they just have one toe, and their teeth got bigger because now they're chewing on grass. They're not eating the forest diet anymore. So the evolution of the horse is a good example of gradualism, but the appearance of, let's say, the eye invertebrates, which occurred really fast in the evolutionary record, that's a good example of a punctuated equilibrium. So it's not one or the other. They both are useful to explain changes within different species. Okay, so this is just an overview of how evolution can lead to speciation, or the origin of new species over time.